This is a video about progress in art. It's mostly framed around Karl Popper's ideas of historicism and his distaste of the direction that art went, specifically music. This will be very casual, is framed as a response to a podcast from Bruce Nielson, episode 97 of Bruce Nielson's Theory of Anything podcast. We've got Bruce, his co-host Peter, and Peter's brother, Chris. Okay, this is one of the most amazing podcasts ever recorded. I love the subject matter. I love the approach to the subject, but they also get a lot of things wrong, and I'm so triggered by it. So there's like it fires me up in an amazing way. I love it. We're going to be talking about classical music. We're going to talk about jazz. We're going to talk about a lot of fun and interesting things. Okay, but it's going to be super casual here, not structured in any way, except for I'm just listening to the podcast and responding based on what I'm listening to.
According to the perspective of someone like you, Chris, and which I think is a pretty valid perspective, swing and bebop was perhaps the highlight of American music. You know, all this great music that America has produced. I think you could make a pretty good case that swing and bebop is our country's musical contribution to the world, amongst all the other great forms of music that have originated in our country. But, you know, has there ever been anything as musically, harmonically sophisticated as bebop and swing? I
Yeah,
am
I think
not
that's
sure.
right. I think that's right.
I really hope that swing and bebop are not just like the end of our musical contributions to the world. Now, I got to say, I love bebop, absolutely love it. Jazz is my thing. But if we haven't really contributed to music in the last, I guess, 100 years, we've got some problems going on here. It hasn't been 100 years. Let's say bebop started around the 50s, right? The 40s and 50s. So if we're coming up to 100 years and we haven't done anything else in America to contribute to music, we've got some issues happening somewhere, at least somewhere. Something's wrong. All right, so they asked the question, has there been anything musically or harmonically sophisticated as swing? And specifically like jazz, bebop era, all of the derivatives of swing and jazz. Has there been anything more sophisticated? I think not, actually. But I think that the way that we evaluate music does not need to be fixed into this sort of classic criteria. We don't need to be essentially only looking at harmony. We don't want to fall into this trap, which a lot of people do, where they evaluate music only by looking at melody, harmony, and rhythm. And they say, well, okay, the melodies have not been improved since Bach. So Bach was the greatest musician and everything else after him sucks, you know, or in this case, harmony hasn't been updated at all since Coltrane, which was going to be an exact example given later. We're not only evaluating music by harmony, at least we shouldn't be only evaluating music by harmony or melody or rhythm or whatever it is the fixed criteria you think it is going to be. Open-ended evaluation here. We want any criteria for evaluating our music. I mean, not any, but it should be not limited, I should be saying. Not limited to harmony. We figured out harmony, we did really well with it, and then we moved on to other more interesting things. That's how I see it, at least.
So at some point, what happened in jazz is that swing and bebop became fusion and avant-garde. I mean, if you took a gun to my head and said, has there ever been a composer as great as Duke Ellington? You know, even though I like heavy metal and just every kind of music that's out there, I'm not exactly sure that I could say that music has produced anything better since the greats of that era, or going back in classical music, Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven. Has there been a composer in the 20th century as great as these dudes?
Has there been a composer in the 20th century that has been greater than these dudes? We're talking about Duke Ellington, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms. That is a fascinating mix of people to put together. I don't even I can't imagine how we group these all together, but we're good with it. We'll stick with it. Okay. I think that the conception of looking at the level of the composer is a mistake. Composition is not the only thing that is musically valuable. And indeed, even a work of art itself is not the main attraction to music. There is knowledge embodied in the work of art. And that is the thing that we need to be focusing on. And whether that knowledge in the work of art, whether there's new knowledge, whether that knowledge can lead to progress, whether that knowledge leads to new problems, these types of things, that will be the focus. I think that's my focus. I think that should be the focus rather than saying there is a particular composer who made good music. So to answer the question directly, has there been a greater composer than Bach or Beethoven or Brahms or Duke Ellington? Man, I think it is such an unfair question because these are all totally different traditions. I don't think it even makes sense to compare Bach to Beethoven. Now, Beethoven to Brahms, that makes sense. And I think Brahms is actually better than Beethoven. I love Brahms. But even then, it's just not even, they're in the same tradition, so it makes sense to have the comparison, but it still doesn't quite make that much sense because Beethoven is the one who continued the existing tradition to hand it off to Brahms to make it better. And Brahms was obviously directly influenced by Beethoven. And then Duke Ellington, again, this is a totally different tradition. And has there been a different jazz composer? Maybe. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question for Duke Ellington. I'm not sure. That's my approach to the answer to that question. Again, it's not really a good answer. I'm not actually directly answering the question, but that's my thoughts on it.
So at a certain point, swing and bebop became fusion and avant-garde. Classical music became minimalist and also avant-garde, something more primitive, I guess. Some ugly might be a word that could be used for some of it. Art Deco in architecture became modernism and functional. And so, fine art obviously became something indistinguishable from garbage at times. Is that a piece, there's these videos I'm sure you've seen. Is that a piece of garbage or an artwork? I don't know. Even cars at some point became ugly. I mean, if you look at the classic cars from the 50s and 60s, like, does that even exist anymore? Even toasters in the 50s were like beautiful works of art. Somehow, for some reason, it doesn't really seem, it seems to me there's been a general decline in quality in art.
All right, so I think that's really funny. All of the examples that Peter gives there. I'm not an expert in cars. I'm not an expert in toasters. I'm not an expert in architecture. So I can't really talk about all those things all at once. Fine art. I can't really bring them all up and give examples for everything and where there was progress and where there wasn't progress. I don't think there's been a total decline generally of all of those things and music. I think there's been some progress in some areas and then some places where there's been decline. And most importantly, along with the progress, there has been new, you need new criteria to understand the progress. This is the interesting thing about new knowledge is that you have, if there's any person that exists or any system that exists, and that system can recognize knowledge, it might start to create specialized mechanisms for identifying knowledge that it already knows, that it already recognizes, right? Like I understand classical music. So if I listen to any music, I can pretty much instantly recognize the harmonies and melodies. I can recognize the chord progressions because I have the specialized mechanism for identifying that. I've become adept at that. As a human, generally speaking, right, I have specialized mechanisms for identifying a human face, okay? If there were going to be something outside of those things, if there's going to be new knowledge as a part of music that is outside of melody, outside of harmony, I am not going to have a specialized mechanism for recognizing that. It's going to take more work to recognize it. So that means it's going to be more subtle. There's another way of saying it's more subtle. The problems and the solutions are going to be more subtle as progress happens, which means that the gross, opposite of subtle here, the gross things of identifying the harmony and melody, those are going to be quick and easy for me to identify. But as the music progresses, I'm going to need to stop focusing on those things and focus on something else. And I don't know what that something else is. So everything is going to seem like a decline. If you ever progress, everything is going to seem like a decline. Let me restate that a little bit more clearly. If there is going to be progression and you have a system, a person who is identifying the quality of the art, and they have fixed criteria for identifying that quality, then that person with the fixed criteria is always going to see decline because they cannot recognize the progress that is happening outside of their fixed criteria.
It's a conservative outlook. I should say though about that I think most of my fellow musicians wouldn't use that word, even those that share my point of view, because it can be confused with political conservatism,
Fair enough.
which most of them are not.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it does share many of the same elements as far as respect for the tradition, respect for the elders of the music, a focus on craft over self-expression. I mean, if
I
those
can
things
see the
are
connection.
conservative, I don't know what is.
I actually like those things. He mentions there respect for tradition, respect for the elders in the tradition. Actually, maybe I don't like that one, but I like this respect for the tradition. I like the focus on craft over self-expression. Big fan, all three of those things. I don't know if that makes me a musical conservative, but I just like those things. I think that the tradition is amazing. I think that the knowledge that was created in the historical traditions definitely should not be abandoned. I think that is a major mistake for a lot of new music, the avant-garde stuff that they refer to that Peter was talking about. A lot of the avant-garde stuff does ignore traditional knowledge or does abandon the knowledge that was created in tradition. I think that is a major mistake. I think we need to keep the knowledge that was in the tradition, improve the knowledge that was in the tradition, and you just never need to completely abandon it.
So he puts this in the context of, maybe you've heard the term historicism, right? This idea that history has a direction, right? It's this idea that music or philosophy has a direction, and that the newest stuff is always the best. So that the idea is that these composers are improving on one another, maybe in a similar way that as science or technology improves. But he's really against that. He does not like
Yes.
historicism in music, and it sounds like you're very aligned with him in that way.
Yes, I never heard it put like that, but I really responded. I love how he expressed that.
I'm fully on board with this. Also, I do not think automatically that the newest thing is the best thing. But I do think that the newest thing is the most possible to be the best. Okay, I feel like I'm saying that weirdly. Let me try to clarify this. I've not written this stuff out. Like I said, this is all casual here. No script today. Okay, so the idea, for example, I'll just give an example of this. In classical music, the focus is on notes. We're just to make it seem simpler, right? Like everything that you can notate in sheet music, that is the focus of classical music. It's the balance between instruments. It's the balance between voices. There's I'm talking about classical era here, by the way, but there's a balance between multiple themes and reconciliation, the conflicts, and so on, blah, blah, blah. Okay. All those things you can do classical era. Okay. Now, in the classical era, they could not do things like make new instruments for a particular melody, right? Like you had a limited ability. Of course, you could try to make a new instrument, but you really couldn't. I mean, come on, you couldn't do that. Today, literally today, a person in their basement, a person in their mom's garage could make a new instrument that is tailor-made for a specific melody. A person could make a virtual room that an instrument can be in so that that instrument has a reverb that matches the exact BPM of the song that they're making. Okay. You can't do this in classical era, classical music. They just didn't have the ability to do this. They didn't have the ability to construct a room that had the perfect reverb to match the exact tempo markings of tempo of the song. Now, this is like something that is regularly done with modern pop music. You listen to modern pop music and you hear somebody singing, like the voice, the reverb of the voice is going to cut off on beat because they have constructed a virtual room to match the BPM of the actual song. And that is something that's regularly done, right? Regularly done also is that they create new instruments. Like you have a synthesizer that has a new tone that no one else has done, and it is made specifically for this song and specifically for this melody in the song. That is something that is regularly done. So with that ability, we now in modern times have a wider ability to control our music, and we've expanded the limitations, like the content of our musical ideas can be much wider, which means that if somebody were to try to create music in the classical tradition, like today, using modern instruments and then modern abilities to create new instruments and create, the stuff I just mentioned, they would have they would be able to do more. It would be better. It would be better. It would be strictly better if they were to try to follow that tradition. What I mean is, if, let's say, Beethoven came back today and continued writing from where he was, but he also had the abilities of modern music, he would make better music. That's what I mean. Not necessarily that it has anybody doing that. No one, I don't think anybody's trying to do that. But the ability is here. We have a greater ability, and this is due to technological changes, but it's also due to changes in our ear, as in the audience expectation has risen. At the time of classical music, they didn't care to make a new instrument and a new room to match their song because that wasn't even, they didn't think it wasn't a consideration. It wasn't in their mind as a problem to be solved or as a potential conflict to be resolved by any particular theory. The conflict of the reverb and the melody did not need to be resolved in the minds of the classical traditions. They didn't consider it. The conflict of a particular instrument making a particular sound, not really they weren't thinking about that type of thing. Not usually. Since this is such commonplace, regularly accounted for things in modern music, that means that we have progressed and we see new problems, and those problems are almost trivial to us, whereas it would have been nearly impossible back in the day, in classical era. Okay, so in that sense, I do think that there has been some sort of necessary progress over time. I mean, maybe necessary is not the right word, but there has been progress over time such that modern musicians fully have the capability of everybody in the past and can do better. Not necessarily that they do, but they can.
This idea that originality is the most important thing, that finding your own voice is something that should be, of the utmost importance, instead of just trying to make the most beautiful music you can.
Chris is saying that essentially, as time progressed from classical music, from Bach up to now, there was a switch somewhere where people started to focus on self-expression, and that became like the predominant way of thinking about music. You care more about self-expression. And the historicist view would be that since that happened over time, we have progressed to self-expression. Therefore, self-expression is the best way to think about music. Whereas Popper is obviously saying that is not right. That is historicism, and it is incorrect to think that whatever is the most current is the best. I should say I am fully on board with that. I don't know if I said this already. I don't particularly like self-expression. I'm not a big fan of it. Not my thing. With music, I don't want to hear self-expression, not too much. I don't want to hear too much biographical anything in music. I'm not overly concerned with like originality just for the sake of doing something new. Not my thing.
You see that that's a real mistake that people make, and that music education, that students are told, find your own voice.
So you see that as pretty bad advice. Don't find your own voice.
Like he says, you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
You will always sound like you,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know. So it's just it's the wrong thing to focus on. And if you're like, what is he? There's a great quote.
So from Popper, for everything a man or an animal can do is, among other things, an expression of an internal state of emotions and of a personality. This is trivially true for all kinds of human and animal languages.
Mhm.
So what he's saying is, yeah, of course it's going to express some inner thing about you. But
Yeah.
pursuing that as the goal doesn't make any sense because it's always going to be true. It's just trivially true. It just doesn't matter as
Mhm.
the goal
Mhm.
of music. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
So as self-expression became the thing that was most important, he sees that as a decline in music.
Yeah.
As great as Beethoven was, and he really admires him, as I do very much. Beethoven should not be seen as the ideal, because that everyone should copy, because
Yeah.
that kind of led to uh, self-expression taking over.
Hmm.
And then in my field, in jazz music, that same thing happened in the 1960s,
Yeah.
when everyone started going on their personal journeys.
Hmm.
It was all about going on a quest of self-expression. If you look at the musicians of that time, like people like Coltrane,
Yeah.
John Coltrane,
Sure.
every album is different. He's changing all the time. He's
Yeah.
on this journey.
Yeah.
Uh, and other musicians tried to do that, and were not so successful at it. But that was just like the direction the music was taking.
All right, it's interesting to hear about John Coltrane and his journey that he went on. Definitely did go through a journey. There are a lot of jazz musicians who did also, and yeah, I don't know. It's not something I think about very much, so I don't really think about how relevant or interesting that is. And I guess it is interesting that people saw that and were influenced by the fact that he went on a journey and changed his music a lot. And then presumably they were inspired to do the same thing, and it led them astray. So I'll just take that history as true because I don't quite know it, but it's interesting enough.
Sure. And, if you
And
think about
and
it,
that's
just from Giant Steps, 1959, the most harmonically complicated music practically ever made. There's a different chord every whatever. There's more chords than you can imagine. And then just a couple years later, moving on with and I love all this stuff too, but moving on to what do you call it? Modal jazz, where it's just like,
Mhm.
there's just like two chords or something.
Yeah, sometimes one chord.
Yeah.
And you're just using a scale, basically.
Oh my God, I hate this. Okay. I hate this. These guys, they don't like modal jazz, apparently. They don't like the cool jazz thing that happened, apparently. It just makes me wince a little bit. Okay. Yes, Coltrane, Giant Steps is great. Boo, doo, 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 boo. We got a lot of chord movement going on. Every other note is a new chord. Oh, how crazy. Okay. Then we have George Russell at some point after Giant Steps. He comes up with his theory, the Lydian chromatic concept of tonal harmony. And he completely changes the way to look at music theory, jazz music theory, but all music theory, generally speaking. And he writes a book about it. He gives it to Miles Davis. He gives it to Coltrane. There's a couple other great musicians, Oliver Nielson, a couple other folks read this. Bill Evans also. All these guys, they learn the Lydian chromatic concept. And then they start to make music that focuses on essentially, fewer chords. They don't really, the changes aren't super important. They don't need to have a lot of changes. changes is a word for chord progression. Okay. And then just like kind of dismissing this whole thing of modal jazz as, just staying on one chord, it's so totally missing the actual knowledge behind it. Like, why are they staying on one chord? What is going on there? And, what was the impact of that? And, okay, the linear chromatic concept, I'm going to try to explain it in the most simple terms in the most brief way I can. Okay. In the simplest, I'm going to go through two parts, two phases of explaining the leading chromatic concept. Okay, phase one of my explanation of the leading chromatic concept, you can start with a single note. And if you ever have a single note, that's always going to imply a interval. So a single note implies an interval. Okay. If you have any interval, that's always going to imply a triad, which just means 3 notes. Interval means 2 notes, triad means 3 notes. Okay, if you have a triad, that's going to imply a chord. That means 4 notes. It's a jazz chord. And if you have a chord, that's going to imply a pentatonic scale, 5 notes, and so on. You get the picture. And if you do that, you're going to eventually imply a regular scale, a 7-note scale, and then you're going to eventually imply the chromatic scale, which is all of the notes. Okay, that is the first pass. That means 1 note implies 2, and then 2 notes implies 3, and 3 notes implies 4. You get the picture. Okay. Oh, and by the way, that what I just described there is the foundation of pretty much all modern, like the way that all jazz is taught now. They have this idea of chord scale theory, which means that a chord implies a scale and the scale implies a chord. So whenever you read a particular scale or whenever you see a particular chord in jazz music, they both imply each other. So like if you see a D dominant chord, it's always going to imply the C Lydian scale. Okay. I gave a bit of an advanced one there. So because people who don't understand music are not going to understand it anyway. But the people who do get music, they might see that and think that's interesting. Okay. Anyway, chord scale relationships. That is from the Lydian chromatic concept. That comes from his theory. So the foundation of all modern jazz education starts there. Great. Okay. Second thing about the Lydian chromatic concept, second phase here, is that it's not always that one note implies one interval. The notes will have a hierarchy of intervals that it implies. So there's going to be a most obvious interval that's implied, a less obvious interval, a less obvious interval, into something that is extremely not obvious. So the obvious ones are going to be called ingoing, and the less obvious ones are going to be outgoing, or they're far out. Okay, so the Lydian chromatic concept just creates this large scale relationship of different things. If you have a particular chord, that means you're implying a range of scales. Some of them are ingoing and some of them are outgoing. Okay, and it does partially depend on your cultural background. It partially depends on the expectations of your audience or whatever. But this is where the things get interesting, because if you know your audience's expectations, then you can play a chord. You know what scale they're going to be thinking. You know what scale is the obvious implication based on the context. And then you play something that is slightly more out. You play something slightly more out. So you're expanding the audience's awareness of the relationship between a particular chord and the scales that it can imply. All right. That's my kind of attempt at a very brief explanation of the Lydian chromatic concept. Man, I really think, I don't know if that's going to work for anybody or anybody's going to understand that. Anyway, radically changed how I write music, and it changed how I listen to music. And it's a fantastic, amazing way to hear music. So it can change art appreciation, or jazz appreciation in particular, but art appreciation broadly. And it most certainly did have a major impact on the way that jazz was made. This is amazing. This is great. This is fantastic. And it expands the ear of the audience of jazz. It made people become more, the range of implications became wider. This just means that the audience could appreciate more music. Because this framework was created, then there was a clear way to expand the audience's ear. And so it led to a clear expansion of the way that people listen to jazz so that you could appreciate more jazz. You can essentially appreciate more notes. So that when you listen to something like Thelonious Monk and he's just playing a lot of random, kind of seemingly random things, it makes more sense. It sounds better because you expand your harmonic horizons as an audience member. And that can be guided by the musicians because they understand what is the most obvious implication and what is the least obvious implication. And that is why when you listen to cool jazz, you hear these certain chords and then you hear the scale that they imply. You're like, oh, that's really cool. It fits well because it sits right outside of your expectations, but it's like close enough that you can expand you can like think about it differently and you can change in your mind and you say, oh, it does fit well. And that's a good way of doing it. All right. That's my very loose and casual attempt to talk about leading chromatic scale, leading chromatic harmony, leading chromatic concept of tonal harmony. And anyway, that is an amazing invention by George Russell. He made it all by himself and completely, totally influenced the direction of jazz. And I think he did a great job at doing that. It also develops a framework for better understanding existing music, all types of music. But, he's a jazz musician, so he talks about better understanding Lester Young, better understanding Coleman Hawkins, better understanding, obviously, Coltrane, Miles Davis, all these folks, Bird, Charlie Parker. Understanding all these guys became much easier because of this new theory. That is genuine progress in art. I mean, if you've ever seen progress in art, oh my God, George Russell was the one who did it. So this movement to modal jazz was definite progress. But you have to have a new appreciation, a new ear to understand what is going on. It's not just more chords in sequence. It's not just this, he calls it horizontal tonal movement. This is vertical tonal movement. All right, that was all the jazz stuff. All right, we're not going to go into any jazz anymore. All right, I get a little bit excited about jazz, mostly because I don't know how to explain it very well, so I just feel a little bit manic about it. I just like it, and I think about playing because I play a lot, and I just want to play more than I want to talk about it. So anyway, I get excited about it. All right, but now we're going to move on to more classical music, which I'm also going to get a little bit excited about. But it's going to be a different type of excitement, I think. I hope. Let's see. Let's find out.
One of Popper's ideas is that he had three worlds that he thought of as three sort of, I think of them as dimensions of reality. World 1, World 2, World 3. World 1 is physical reality that's all around us. World 2 is subjective states of consciousness. And then World 3 is, I guess you can think of it as memes or even our ideas that are out there in this reality outside of our brains. He talks about this in the context of Bach and Beethoven. Beethoven is more associated with World 2, which is more like subjective states of consciousness, whereas Bach is World 3. He definitely associates Beethoven's music with more self-expression and Bach as more like objectively solving problems.
All right. Well, I think it's quite a good idea to consider Beethoven to be more associated with self-expression because he expresses himself, he expresses his emotions, his personal anguish and whatever. And while Bach is not associated with that type of thing, that makes a lot of sense to me. That's totally fair. I'm fully on board with that distinction. I understand it. It doesn't follow for all of the art, or like all of the works that Beethoven has written. But we get what he means by that. It's a clear enough understanding.
And he even says in there that this is totally imprecise and he's probably exaggerating the differences between Bach and Beethoven and that he loves both.
Yes.
So I wouldn't make too much big of a deal out of this. But he definitely says that Bach is more the objective and Beethoven is more the subjective. Well, he says, I felt there could be no greater danger to music than an attempt to make Beethoven's ways an ideal or a standard or a model, which is basically the direction music went, for better or for worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
After Beethoven, it became more about self-expression.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so according to Popper, Beethoven ruined music. He influenced Schubert and Berlioz, and those folks, and that just led to, I guess, Mendelssohn also maybe would count in there. I'm not sure. I'm not sure when the decline happened specifically in the mind of Popper. But those are the folks that Beethoven sort of influenced, and then we got into the Romantic era, and then music became more about expressing. It doesn't even have to be about self-expression. So there's just a long debate in classical music. I guess there's two senses of the word classical music. So classical music means all of it. Like classical music is just like, I don't know, music that you would hear on the piano or something, right? There's classical music, and then there's classical era music, which is a totally different thing. So classical music overall, there was a little bit of a debate during the Romantic era, and kind of leading outside of the Romantic era and going out beyond that, where some people really wanted to focus on something called absolute music, and other people focused on something called program music. And both of these people did not like each other. The groups of people who liked absolute music did not like program music. The people who liked program music did not like absolute music. Program music is essentially music that is expressive of something. It doesn't have to be self-expression, but it could just be narrative. Something that is about it could be dramatic, or it could like evoke a story. That would be program music, whereas absolute music has no narrative attached to it. It's not expressing any particular idea. Nothing is being expressed. It's just the musical ideas themselves. Essentially, nothing refers to something else. There's no referential component to the music. Okay, and then Beethoven, of course, he was a part of the classical tradition. So he was with the absolute music, but then at some point he started to include things that were more referential, that referenced other things. And he changed a lot of the forms in order to accommodate that type of thing, right? Like, for example, he was writing music that was all in sonata form. Sonata just means instrumental. He was writing a lot of instrumental music. And the symphonies are instrumental. Symphonies are in the sonata forms. Symphony, you literally start and end with sonata form in the symphony. Like there's like a small version of the sonata form, which is a type of movement in your symphony. And then the broader sense of the sonata form is like how you organize an entire symphony, the four movements of your symphony. Beethoven was working with the sonata forms, and then literally in his Ninth Symphony, he has a very extended choral part. It's no longer in sonata form. It's no longer a instrumental work. It is now a cantata. In cantata, it just means it's a spoken part, spoken language, spoken music, as opposed to instrumental music. Okay, so Beethoven's kind of breaking stuff already. That's what he starts doing, and he's adding more emotions into his stuff, and it's obvious what those emotions are. He's attempting to express certain things with his music, and that continued for a long time. If you're kind of the classical mindset, this absolute music mindset, essentially all the music that you're going to be making is going to be instrumental music. I'm saying this a little weirdly. It's not all the music that you make, because there were operas and there were things called songs or lieder, and those were spoken sometimes, or they had they referenced things. So there's like a set of stuff like that, operas and lieder, but the sonatas, the instrumental music, like the chamber music, the string quartet or the piano trio or the violin sonata or the concerto or the symphony, all of those things are going to be non-referential. They don't refer to anything else. They don't make any attempt to express any particular emotion. In the classical era, the classical mindset, all of that is going to be absolute music. And the only time that you're going to be expressing anything is in songs. That's a particular form of music. It's called song. Or lieder, it's called lieder. They use a German word for it. only songs are going to be spoken parts with reference to other things. And then you're going to have obviously operas. Operas are going to be referring to the narrative. Okay.
To read this quote, he says, I should perhaps start with a criticism of a widely accepted theory of art, the theory that art is self-expression, or the expression of the artist's personality, or perhaps the expression of his emotions. The main criticism of this theory is simple. The expressionist theory of art is empty. For everything a man or an animal can do is, among other things, an expression of an internal state, of emotions, of a personality. This is trivially true for all kinds of humans and animal languages. It holds for the way a man or a lion walks, the way a man coughs or blows his nose, the way a man or a lion may look at you or ignore you. It holds for the way a bird builds its nest, a spider constructs its web, and a man builds his house. In other words, it is not a characteristic of art. For the same reason, expressionist or emotive theories of language are trivial, uninformative, and useless. I do not, of course, propose to answer the what is question, what is art, but I do suggest that what makes a work of art interesting or significant is something quite different from self-expression.
I think he says elsewhere how disappointed he was to come to the conclusion that Beethoven was not the ideal because he admired his music so much, as do I.
All right. I love the disdain of which he's saying that. I don't think I agree with exactly what he's saying. Like, I do think there's a major difference between literally saying I am happy, right? There's one thing. And then there's like skipping down the street. Okay, that's like, maybe it does say similar things. But then like if you're just like living your regular life and like eating cereal and then just like, I don't know, watching YouTube or something, I don't know what regular people do. If you just live your life, you go to the grocery store, I mean, I guess you're expressing your inner self in some way, but like it's totally, there's a difference. There's some difference here. I don't think it's so trivial as much as Popper is making it out to be. But anyway, as a person, me, who loves classical music, I'm a big fan of the classical era. I like this sort of absolute music thing. So I'm on board with the idea, generally speaking. I don't like this movement towards self-expression. I don't want to hear any of the self-expression. I want to hear the music. I want to hear the relationships of the things in the music. I only care about that. I want to hear the exploration of the sonata form or whatever. Like, I'm interested in that type of thing. I don't really care about, how angry or whatever somebody is or how happy they are. I mean, I guess Mendelssohn's cool. He's got some happy music, but like, that's just not the thing I care about. But Popper does say that he says specifically self-expression is not the interesting thing in art. I fully agree with this. I think that art is a play of knowledge, right? It's like a breeding ground for new knowledge. It's a weird way of putting it, maybe. It is a way to display and create new knowledge. And then with that creation of new knowledge, create new problems. And then people can resolve those problems and progress even further with more new knowledge. So, of course, it is best. The most interesting thing would be to display some new knowledge that could actually be progressed. Now, if I'm just displaying my own self-expression, no one independent of me can improve my own self-expression. Maybe I can improve my self-expression, but I can only improve it so much. If I display a new musical problem or a new musical solution that creates new musical problems, then that is going to lead to more progress. That's going to be the interesting thing. That's the part that is relevant in art. I think that is a significant aspect of art. That's what Popper is talking about. Self-expression is not that interesting or significant. The other things are interesting and significant. Now, it might seem a bit contradictory to say that self-expression is not interesting or significant, where self-expression is the thing that took over and became the most obviously interesting thing, because people only care about that. They don't care about the sonata forms. Ain't nobody listening to Haydn and being like, wow, I wonder how he's going to resolve the conflict between these two themes. Like, no one's doing that. I mean, people aren't even listening to Beethoven and thinking about that. But that's literally what the whole point of the music is like resolving these two themes. Of course, okay, so people aren't going to be listening and thinking about those things. They're going to be thinking about the emotional expression. What's going on there? What's happening there? As I said before, you can create specialized mechanisms for identifying knowledge that you already have or that you're familiar with. I know how to identify emotions in other people because I know what the emotions are. I know the emotional range of humans, generally speaking, of our modern times. The expression of those things are pretty clear. I know how to recognize if anger or happiness or sadness or ecstasy is being expressed in emotion. I know how to identify that if it's being expressed in a person. I know how to identify that. I have a specialized mechanism for identifying those things. I do not have a specialized mechanism for identifying the interesting parts of music. I don't have a specialized mechanism for listening to Bach, who is writing a singular melody, and then having a singular melody be broken up or being stretched or being compressed, and then the melody itself interacts with itself. Okay, I don't have any specialized mechanism for identifying that. So if I listen to the music of Bach, it's going to be pretty boring to me because I don't know how to even listen to it. I don't have the mechanism for identifying the knowledge that is being displayed in the music of Bach. So obviously I'm going to be more interested in the self-expression because I can identify it much more than I can identify the knowledge that's being presented in Bach. That is what's happening there. So it might be a little bit wrong or contradictory to say that the interesting thing about art is not self-expression. Really, art is about creating new knowledge, but if you're creating new knowledge, it's always going to be difficult to identify the new knowledge. It's going to be more difficult to identify the new knowledge than it is to identify existing knowledge. So that's the difficulty. That is why the self-expression type of thing will catch on. That is why fixed criteria are always going to be more popular, right? That is why, people are going to complain about, for example, the lack of richness of melodies in modern music because they learned to identify melodies in music. And they think that melody is the only way to evaluate music, right? But they're not going to be listening for if the reverb is not contradicting the melody and the instrumentation, all that stuff I talked about earlier. You're going to have a new way of understanding music to be able to identify that. And that's difficult to do.
I didn't quite understand this part, so I actually wanted to get you guys' opinion on this. He clearly thinks of Beethoven as a great composer on par with Bach, but he sees Beethoven as going about this in a way that's unhealthy. And yet he clearly did it well, right? Now, why is that? Is that because Beethoven is the argument implicitly that it's because Beethoven happens to just be that good? He could get away with breaking the rules?
Basically, yeah. I think Beethoven gets a pass because he had such a strong. I mean, his music is generally just so strong, but also his, like the way I've put it before, is the musical journey that he went on was so compelling, and it came about at a specific time when the classical forms were being uh, well, expanded upon, which he was one of the first to do. But he says that shouldn't be the ideal. It's okay for Beethoven to do that, but if you're using that as a model for your own music, it's a bit arrogant.
Basically, geniuses can't help but be geniuses, right? So if you're Beethoven
Yeah.
and you're this dynamic, interesting person, you just can't help but put that out there in your music, but it shouldn't be the focus of your music. Would you say
Yeah.
that's fair?
I think this is totally misguided what Chris is saying here. It's not that Beethoven is just so good that he could be allowed to break the rules. It's that Beethoven was focused on the objective part, right? So whatever we call the world three component of music, Beethoven was also focused on that. So his main focus was not just self-expression. It's not like he only did self-expression. He created new knowledge in his music that actually did progress classical music quite a lot. I think it is a little bit unfair or maybe just weird. I don't know what the right word is, but it's misleading to say that the classical forms were being expanded at the time. Like he was at a special time where the classical forms were being expanded. I think that's just not. There's something misleading about that, because if you really look and understand like the history of these things, like Bach was making music in the 1700s, like early 1700s, and died somewhere before, I don't know, 1730s or something. I don't remember. Um, he was doing his musical thing, all right, and then he died, and pretty much his whole tradition kind of died with him. Like his kids kind of did some type of things that were similar to him, but it just died. All right, done. Bach's tradition, finito, done. Okay, we get Haydn, who is making music around the 1760s. Okay, 1760s, he's going crazy. He's making music. All right, Haydn actually literally invented all of the classical forms, all of the norms of classical music, all of the genres of classical music. He made the piano trio. He made the string quartet. He made the symphony. He made the idea of contrasting two different themes, and he made the ideas of like what order you put those themes. You know, you play the first theme, you play the second theme in a different key, and then you do a exploration. You do a development section where you fragment all the themes, you make them even more differentiated, make them more different, and then you come back and recombine them. You play the first theme and you play the second theme and you play them in the same key. Right? This whole format was made by Haydn. He's the one who invented this stuff. Okay, and then like the norm of having sonata form be the first movement, and then the second movement be a slow movement, and the third movement be a minuet or scherzo, and then the fourth movement be another sonata form movement or a rondo or whatever. All that again, totally made by Haydn. He invented all these things. Okay, he did all that in 1760s. Okay, and that kind of led to, I don't know, 1790s. I don't know how long he was active. I think he died in the 90s. And he taught Beethoven stuff. Okay, the timeline must be a little bit off here, but something like that. Okay, he taught Beethoven. Okay, and then Beethoven started to be writing independently in like the 1810s or the 18 something, 1800, early 1800s. Okay, so it kind of doesn't make sense to. The reason why I'm saying this is a little bit misleading, that the classical forms were being expanded upon. They were just invented. They were like invented 30 years ago. Like it's not like the classical forms were there and they existed for hundreds of years, and then Beethoven suddenly broke down the walls. Haydn made the classical forms like 30 years before Beethoven and taught it to Beethoven, and then Beethoven continued to innovate on those classical forms. Mozart also was working in the 1780s and 90s and whatever, and he was working with Haydn's classical forms, but he didn't do any particular innovations. He didn't try to break them at all. He just stuck with them really, really cleanly. But again, there's not like a long tradition of people following the classical forms, and then Beethoven came along. It was like the next generation. So it's not really that Beethoven was at like a special time to, I don't think he was at a special time to innovate the classical forms. He started doing the thing immediately. Classical forms weren't like fully established before he broke them. They were just being established. Okay, and I don't think that it's just that Beethoven was like such a genius that he's able to do self-expression and get a pass. The relevant part is that he actually did innovate on the classical forms. Like he followed in Haydn's tradition and did the proper innovations within Haydn's tradition. So musically, very, very significant outside of any version of self-expression. In fact, if you just cut off the last, I don't know, 15 years of whatever Beethoven's music, and you'd still have massive, massive innovation. Like the sense of balance between Beethoven's music, like the scale of his instrumental music for singular instruments, that alone, amazing. Okay. And then his innovations in the chamber music to actually have this equal balance between all the voices, amazing. And the same with the symphony. He had a much more equal balance between the wind section and the string section and the blah, blah, blah. All of those things happened with Beethoven, totally outside of the reference of anything to do with subjective emotional expression. So the reason why Beethoven gets a pass is because all of that other stuff was not relevant. Like his emotional expression stuff does not matter to his development of music. Now, he also additionally innovated in that sense, but you could just not count that and it would still be great innovations. So I think that's the thing that is confusing. I guess the real part of it that's confusing to Bruce is that he's thinking of it in terms of entire works of art, and in this case, entire composers, which also it seems like Popper was doing something similar. You're thinking of entire works of art or entire composers, right? So if you're only thinking about music in the sense of this composer did this thing and we can only evaluate the entire composer, as opposed to let's evaluate these different eras of the composer, and even more fine-grained, we can say, well, let's evaluate the specific knowledge that was innovated in this particular work. That's a totally different thing. But of course, when you start to think of it as knowledge, and that means that there's replicators in the music, and the replicators are different from the environment, or the replicators are different from the vehicle. The art is a vehicle for the knowledge. The art is a vehicle and an environment for the knowledge. But the knowledge is the important part. The knowledge is the relevant thing to look at. So there's a lot of knowledge that was created by Beethoven in all of his compositions. And that can be completely separated from any of his personal expression. So I think the confusion from Bruce comes from this sort of low resolution view. He's not looking at the knowledge. He's looking at the composer, which is just a mistake in terms of understanding how replicators work, right? Basic replicator stuff. Bruce understands all this, I'm sure just pointing it out to Bruce, he would totally understand it immediately, like pick up on all that stuff immediately and all the implications of that. But it's just like, you have the misunderstanding. You think that you're looking at the sense of the composer, or you're evaluating each individual work of art as a work of art altogether, and you're not noticing the fact that there's knowledge embodied in the work of art, and you can evaluate the knowledge independently. But I do agree that your personal expression doesn't need to be the focus. But even if it is the focus, who cares? It can be the focus as long as you're also making other new knowledge. The thing that is important is the creation of the new knowledge. So it doesn't matter what you're focusing on as long as you're creating the new knowledge.
Well, here's a quote where he lays it out. He says, "What I have said may indicate what the difference was between Bach and Beethoven, which so impressed me. Bach forgets himself in his work. He is a servant of his work. Of course, he cannot fail to impress his personality on it. This is unavoidable. But he is not, as Beethoven is, at times, conscious of expressing himself and even his moods. It was for this reason that I saw them as representing two opposite attitudes towards music."
Bach was just trying to craft the most beautiful fugue or whatever he was doing as possible. And like Popper says, even on the his inventions on his title page, he says, "This is for educational purposes. This is to teach people how they could compose themselves a proper invention."
Hmm.
Yeah, I like this idea from Bach, to teach those. I've heard the quote translated in many different ways, but whatever the idea is, I like it. It's all for educational purposes. It's all about new knowledge, and he's just transmitting that new knowledge to more people. He wants anybody who's a musician interested in the new knowledge to be able to read his music and see the things that he's doing, and then take that and put it into their music, or continue with those ideas. Right? It's new knowledge being presented, and he wants that new knowledge to be explored. That's definitely how I see it, and I like that Bach talks about that directly. That's how he sees it also.
Is this a more generalizable thing? I mean, obviously, we talked about generalizing this to epistemology, so it must be a very generalizable idea. But can we speak of other art having a similar sort of problem like this, modern artistic trends and things like that? would that be fair, or would that be? Is this something that you
Oh,
see
yeah.
as primarily? Uh, okay, so you do think that's fair.
I
Um,
think, yeah, in other fields of art, um, visual art, architecture.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the thing about if you look at something, if you go to a modern art gallery, you've almost got to bring some so-called education to it. You've got to know about, what the artist is trying to convey and their perspective, and maybe you read about their philosophy or something like that.
to be
Whereas,
able to appreciate it.
yes, whereas if you go to, something more classical art, fine art or whatever, it's more there's a virtuosity to it where you can
Right.
just look at it and just get lost in just how
Right.
beautiful this painting is.
That is the funniest thing. I just love Peter, and like he seems to hate it so much. I think he's totally wrong here, by the way. But like just the passion of the way that he says it. You gotta be educated. You know? That was the funniest thing ever. Okay, Peter, hilarious. All right, great stuff. Okay, I think he's totally wrong though. Wrong in that um, if there is beauty, you have to have knowledge in order to appreciate it. It's just necessarily the case. There's no way that you can have something that you can appreciate with no knowledge at all. You have to have some knowledge to appreciate it. If anything, you have to have eyes. If anything, you have to have ears, right? And so that's knowledge kind of found in your DNA, sure. Okay. So there's that along. That's the most basic sort of thing there we start with. Secondarily, it is definitely not true that people can just go to a symphony and be taken by the beauty of classical music, or like people just go to an art museum and they just love all of these paintings. There's a reason why all of these things have to be actively preserved, is because no one really cares about it. Like if a modern person goes to listen to classical music or to Bach or Beethoven or any of these folks, they're not going to enjoy any of it because they don't know what to listen for. And the reason why they don't know what to listen for is because they're not educated. Another way of putting it is that they have not created the knowledge required to replicate the knowledge that is in the work of art. Did that make any sense? It probably didn't. But you need to be able to identify what problems are being solved by Beethoven in a particular song. And you can't do that if you don't know music theory, for example, or if you don't know like the symphonic or the sonata forms. You have to have the knowledge. And then the people who do have that knowledge, like other musicians, are going to be obviously more trained in music and they're going to appreciate the music much more. There's a reason why classical musicians love classical music, right? There's a reason why jazz musicians like jazz music, okay? They can appreciate it better. They're literally trained in appreciating it better. So it's not just that there's like classical music or any type of music that's like this magical, you need no knowledge prerequisite in order to appreciate it. It's totally wrong. And it's almost absurdly obviously wrong because clearly, very clearly, a regular person isn't going to appreciate anything about classical music. Just ask a regular person. They might play it in the background. They might say, "Oh, it's kind of calming," but like ask them anything about it. They're like, "Oh, it's kind of cool." Like, oh, yeah, what are they appreciating about this classical music? And then compare that to a person who's trained in classical music and ask them to appreciate it. Is it going to be totally worlds apart here? Okay. I think it is very important to say that to appreciate beauty, you need to have some knowledge. You're always going to have some knowledge required to appreciate beauty. If somebody just tells you something like, "Hey, listen to this Bach fugue," and you listen to it and you're like, "Oh, that's kind of cool." Okay, and then somebody says, "All right, now this is the Bach fugue. Now when it starts, he's going to play a melody. Okay, and then that melody is going to be repeated. It's going to be repeated multiple different times in multiple different ways, and these are some of the ways that it's going to be repeated. And now listen to it. You're going to appreciate the music better. It's just having that little bit of knowledge is going to be helpful." Okay, so I'm saying all that to say appreciation requires knowledge. So this disdain for people needing to understand or read something before they go to a museum, it falls flat to me, on me. I think it's great to be able to look at a classical painting and understand the diagonals and dynamic symmetry, or understanding the balance and harmony. Like, to me, that's really important and interesting. And you have to be educated in those things to be able to understand that. And then once you're educated in those things, you can see more subtle problems being solved, and you can see all the knowledge that's being displayed in that work of art. A regular person isn't going to be able to do that. So being educated, having knowledge makes appreciation better. And the ideal of having somebody just be like, I'm so taken by this work of art, without having any knowledge. I think that's a failure, and it leads to other types of things. Like, essentially it leads to only caring about works of art or progress in art that is based on things that are easily recognizable by humans. Like, I could just literally have blinking lights, and that would literally attract all humans, right? Like, just having the flashing lights would attract all humans, right? And if that were the foundation of all of my art, it would be attractive to all humans instantly, like without the need of any extra knowledge, because that is like knowledge already baked into our DNA, let's say, to be able to recognize flashing lights as being interesting, right? So if you were to take it to its logical conclusion, to try to remove any sort of knowledge in order to appreciate a work of art, and you're only left with the knowledge that's already baked into a human, then you're going to be left with this sort of base level, flashing lights, primary colors, extreme saturation, that type of thing. So I think the mindset of not needing any sort of education to appreciate a work of art will degrade towards that. Which is all to say, I think it's just an accident. I think it's a mistake. Obviously, I think Peter's making a mistake by putting it in that way. However, I think it's hilarious. And I like the passion. Okay, I like the passion in his voice. There's just the total disdain for modern arts. Oh my God, it's hilarious. We're not going to go into a whole segment here because I absolutely love modern art. We're not going to go into a whole segment about me talking about the knowledge that is actually embodied in modern art, and minimalism and so on and so forth. We're not going to get into all that type of stuff. But there is a whole other conversation to be had about the fact that brutalist architecture and minimalist art and so on does actually create new knowledge and display that new knowledge, and is actually very helpful for artists and so on, and it's great for appreciation. And there's a lot there, and there's a whole conversation to be had about that. But the point that Peter makes does still stand. Some art doesn't create new knowledge, and it is indistinguishable from garbage, literally in the literal sense that he talks about, but also metaphorically in the metaphorical sense of it's not creating anything new. So that still stands, and I fully agree that does exist. It does happen, and that is a problem, and we should be able to recognize it. And the way to recognize that is to understand this knowledge-based view, to understand where there is new knowledge being displayed and where there's no knowledge being displayed. It's all just zero reach nonsense. It's being preserved for random cultural reasons or whatever, arbitrary cultural reasons, and so on.
Yeah, and modern art is more about the philosophy behind it. More about
I don't think
art
Popper liked
philosophy.
that at all. Yeah, he even talks about at one point. I actually know this is getting into the next chapter, but he talks about how these anti movements you have even worse than the
Oh yeah,
seeing art is self-expression, is seeing these artistic movements that are like a reaction to another movement or something. I mean, I think I agreed with him there. I don't see much value in that kind of thing.
That's funny that he says, okay, obviously modern art is more about the philosophy, and Popper doesn't like that. Okay, sure, great. If you had a work of art that were only about the music, let's say, just like a Bach fugue only about the music. Great. I think that'd be great. Great. And then if we had a similar work of art, Bach style fugue, but it also had hidden meaning in it that is related to philosophy. That would, at that point, be an expansion of the content of the music. So the music is obviously, the content is only musical ideas. And for example, if you were to make only musical ideas, but then you also created a visual experience to go along with that, then you're expanding the content to visual experience, right? That's what I mean by content. You're expanding it to visual. It'll now be auditory and visual. But here in this case, if you expand it to philosophy, now you have this sort of philosophical content, and it's in harmony or potentially not in harmony with the musical content. So it's expanding the content. There are more ways that the music can go wrong, essentially, which I think is a good thing. I think this is not a problem. This is a great thing. I think this is an amazing thing that we have this modern and contemporary art that focuses on philosophy. Let me restate that, because I said it wrong, and I'm actually wrong about that. But let me try to say what I'm saying. Okay, I think it is good that that dimension was opened up, and now it is possible to include that in your work of art. Now you can make a work of art that has something to do with politics or social issues and so on, and that can be embedded within your work of art. So now you are literally expanding the content of the potential content for your work of art. Now, I don't particularly like the focus. Again, I don't like the dismissal of all traditional forms and all traditional knowledge and only focusing on that. I like the fact that it is now a possibility to include that. That's what I mean.
So how would this relate to David Deutsch's idea of objective beauty, if at all? So David Deutsch has a chapter on why flowers are beautiful. And one of the things he does say, I would have to go find the quote, is that because there is such a thing as an objective beauty, that we can make progress towards that objective standard or ideal of beauty forever, meaning that it should be the case that we should be able to find increasingly good music, and that to infinity, right? That it will always be that we can improve the beauty of our music. Now, I actually took some issues with some things that David Deutsch said in that chapter. So I'm not sure if I agree or disagree with that. And I mean that quite literally, like I don't know. I'm not being cute here. I'm kind of open to the possibility he's right. I'm kind of open to the possibility that he's over-interpreting this. But is Popper agreeing or disagreeing with David Deutsch on this idea that I guess I could see Popper's stance that the new version of music is always better, that he's got a problem with that, although he's not denying some sense of progress, but just the idea that it's always going to keep improving.
Yeah.
That seems to me like maybe it's at odds with David Deutsch's view on objective beauty from that chapter.
Yeah.
And he mentions music as a specific example. So this isn't just me throwing music in there. He throws out music as an example of objective beauty.
Yeah. He seems to be saying that not everything newer is better, but there are still musical problems to be worked out, right? So I don't think he rejects the idea that progress is possible in music.
Well, and one thing he says that if you have an advantage for coming after someone like Beethoven did after Bach, or Mozart did after Bach, because you can try to master what Bach gave us. And it's like he relates that to Einstein and Newton, or it's like he says, was Einstein a better physicist than Newton? Maybe not, but he mastered Newtonian physics.
Yeah. Well, let's get really out there. Let me ask you this, Chris. 1,000 years from now, we're on the Dyson sphere in a post-biological state. Death has been cured. Presumably, musical problems will have been worked out during this time, and will become objectively better and better? Will the composers of then make Bach look like a child banging on a piano?
I can't see that happening.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
I read
it's
Popper as
hard for me to
saying
imagine.
I read Popper as saying he can't see it happening either, right?
Yeah.
And maybe I'm
Yeah.
reading too much in, and I don't think Popper is quite clear enough that I can be sure I got what he meant, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But I read Deutsch as saying, yes, someday we're going to, while we're living on the Dyson sphere, see Bach as a child banging on the piano. And he would never literally say that, of course, but that's the feeling I get. And I read Popper as saying, look, there is going to be progress and there'd be interesting problems to solve in that sense. Oh, here it is. Of course, there can be something like progress in art in the sense that certain new possibilities may be discovered and also new problems. In music,
Mhm.
such inventions as counterpoint revealed almost an infinity of new possibilities and problems. So he says that. That's the part that you were kind of getting at, Peter. But then he immediately goes on to say he just doesn't really agree that on the Dyson sphere that Bach is going to be like a child banging on the piano, right? Like,
Well, he just says it's never happened in music. What I said about Einstein and Newton, that never happened in music.
right.
According to Popper, like the people that came the closest to the Bach's mastery was perhaps Mozart, and he didn't do it. So it's just never happened before.
I'm so triggered. Okay. I'm so triggered. All right. I'm triggered quite a bit here. All right. First thing to say is that I'm on board with, we will get to a point where music of the past seems like childish or not very well, whatever. I think there's probably two ways to think about this differently. The first way is that um, you want to, is something that's childish is not refined, as in like the execution is very poor. And then the second thing is that the scope of it is very narrow. So those are two separate things. And I think we're already at the point. I mean, most people probably don't agree with me on this one. I think we're already at the point where Bach's music, the scope is narrow. It's obviously recognizably narrow. That means that Bach is writing for harpsichord or for clavichord, maybe for organ in some cases. And I think he wrote some, some string music and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Well, I'm just thinking about his fugues. Bach wrote for the clavier, clavichord, or the harpsichord, or the organ. Okay. He has this narrow range of things that he writes with. Okay. And then we have somebody like Beethoven, who's writing for a piano, which is totally different from the harpsichord. And it automatically has new things that you can do, such as dynamics. You don't have dynamics in the harpsichord. You don't have dynamics in the organ. You do have dynamics in a piano. So there's a whole new range of things that can happen. There's a whole new range of problems that can exist in the music of Beethoven. Okay, so that's like one expansion, the expansion of like the scope of things that are possible. Okay. And then it gets stranger where we talk about like the inventions of Chopin, where he's writing like these very strange rhythms where you can play 11 notes in one hand. That's, in one bar, you got 11 notes as opposed to you need to have 4 notes at a time, or eighth notes. You need to have quavers and semiquavers and so on. When you get to that, you have this whole expansion of the new type of music. You have different types of rhythms that you can do. Now we have musical recording, so you can actually record the music, and then the way that you place the mic is relevant to how the music sounds. So that becomes a part of the music. All right. So we have this expansion of different things. Okay. So the music that is being written today, it might be important how the piano is literally mic'd. It might be important how the size of the room and the reverb of the room. It might be important the specific rhythms going, all those things might be important. Bach, he didn't have the awareness to care about those things, and he didn't have any notation to notate it. And he obviously didn't have any recording equipment to record it. So literally already the scope that we care about today is much wider than Bach had. So in that sense, a kid who makes a work of art, they're only using crayon on paper. right? That's kind of the childish thing, is that they're using crayon and paper. Doesn't matter how good they get with it, they're still doing crayon on paper. So they have like a limited scope. That's like one element of something being childish. The other thing is that it's not refined. And obviously, I don't think we're going to get to a point where we think of Bach as not very well refined, as solving the problems that he solved. The reason why I think this is because his tradition pretty much died. We don't have people doing fugues and improving that. And we do have Schoenberg, who continued the tradition of Bach and tried to make music similar. Like, you only have one theme and that theme repeats, and that theme is played on itself. You play the theme forward and backwards, and specifically with Schoenberg's serialist music, he did that. But really, obviously, Schoenberg's tradition didn't really continue that much. Serialism didn't continue that much. That died. Okay. Dead, completely gone, done. Okay, the part that actually triggered me here is that Chris says that Mozart kind of rivals Bach. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. Okay, Mozart is a totally different tradition than Bach is. Mozart is in the classical tradition. Bach is in the Baroque tradition. They have totally different types of problems going on. There's not even a way to compare them. Mozart was always doing multiple themes. Mozart doing operatic music and so on and so forth. I'm thinking about the instrumental music. Instrumental music of Mozart, we're always going to be comparing multiple themes. We're not going to be doing a single theme and fugue that's interacting with itself. That doesn't happen in Mozart. But that's pretty much the focus of Bach. Okay, Mozart is comparing two different themes, contrasting different themes, and then reconciling those contrasts, usually, of those themes. That's what happens with Mozart. You have the first movement in one key, you have the second movement in a different key, you have the third movement in a different key, and the fourth movement in the first key, right? You have this dynamic movement of this sort of comparison, this contrast, and this reconciliation happening. That happens in Mozart. Bach doesn't do that. That's not even in his worldview. That's like he doesn't think about that at all. It's not even relevant at all to Bach, because they're totally different traditions. They can't even be compared. They shouldn't be compared in any sense at all. Okay, now, has any musician taken over, like Newton existed and had his understanding, and then Einstein totally understood everything from Newton and then continued and went further? Has anybody done that before? Yes. Haydn started the classical tradition. Haydn invented all of the sonata forms, all of the forms that we think of as the instrumental musical forms. They started with Haydn. He invented the classical tradition. This is after Bach. So he's completely unrelated to Bach. He's not influenced by Bach at all. It has nothing to do with Bach. Bach is the Baroque tradition. His tradition died. Haydn invented classical music, invented the classical traditions, invented the classical aims, invented all of the classical, interesting things in classical music, the goals of balance, the goals of contrasting themes, all of that was invented by Haydn. Okay. Mozart understood it 100%. Mozart got he understood the assignment. Okay. Mozart got it. Mozart totally understood everything from Haydn and did very well with it. He did a great job. So there is already this total absorption. Haydn is Newton and Mozart is Einstein. Okay. In some sense, it's not really true. The analogy doesn't really hold up, because we have someone even better, which is Beethoven. Beethoven totally, 100%, absolutely understood everything that Haydn was doing. All of Haydn's aims, every Haydn problem, everything in Haydn was perfected in Beethoven and progressed, and we got to something better. Okay, totally, absolutely, literally everything. We got it. So yes, there is an Einstein and Newton in classical music. It's Beethoven and Haydn. Okay, and then we even go farther. We get Brahms. Brahms, my guy, totally understood Beethoven. He fully integrated all of the knowledge of Beethoven and created and went further and progressed even further. Yes, totally, absolutely, yes. And then, not to mention all of the other Romantic era composers who were more into the absolute music than the program music. They understood pretty well all of the things that Haydn and Beethoven were doing. They understood well enough, well enough. They did it. They did pretty good. We do have this total absorption and progress that happens in music. And the tradition of Brahms, fantastic. There was a couple more generations after that went strong. Eventually, it was all taken over by the program music. So we get Berlioz, starting with the Romantic kind of stuff. He was influenced by Beethoven heavily, and then that continues over to like Liszt, and that continues over to like, I don't know, Mahler and like Wagner and all these kind of guys, right? So then we get this sort of rejection of the absolute music, and we get into this sort of expressive music where you're expressing something, or you're dramatizing something. There's a narrative to be attached to it. That happens at some point. That sort of takes over all of the absolute music, and sort of Haydn's tradition pretty much dies out at some point around the time of like Mahler. And it goes a little bit further than Mahler because, of course, Mahler is still writing in sonata forms, so he's still continuing the tradition. And then we get resurgence. We get Prokofiev, we get Shostakovich, we get Bartok, all these guys. They're working within pretty much the same tradition of Haydn. Except they just have a lot more chromaticism going on there. Okay, sure, good, fair enough, good. But eventually, it's all taken over, and then now we just have film music, right? We don't really have classical music at all. The tradition of classical music is dead. We just have film music, and it's all expressive. Anything that you want to hear that's symphonic, you really want it to be like evoking emotions. You want it to be having a narrative. That's how the modern way of interacting with classical music is now these days. So tradition of Haydn, pretty much dead. No one's writing a symphony with 4 parts in the strict sonata form. Gone. All that's dead. But, it had a good run. And I think it actually did have this progress. It did have this sort of people were absorbing and progressing. That literally did happen. Totally there. Yes. I just think that most people don't understand. Obviously, no one's like reading the history of classical music because most people aren't interested in classical music to start with. I just happen to be interested in the classical forms. This all comes from Schoenberg. What I mean is my interest comes from Schoenberg. I love Schoenberg. Schoenberg is the one who showed me how to listen to classical music. Okay, Schoenberg created serialism. I'm not talking about this stuff. Okay, he was an amazing Romantic era composer. Schoenberg, like late Romantic era. He worked with the late Romantic era stuff. He liked this sort of impressionistic music that was kind of going around in the 1920s and so on. And then he invented his serialism. But before he did all of his serialist stuff, but before that, and obviously, not that obviously, but before the serialist stuff, he was into regular classical music, and he taught classical music, and he invented new ways to appreciate classical music. He did beautiful things. Okay, I don't really need to go into all that. We're going to cut this. Okay, Schoenberg's amazing. That's progress in art too? Okay, not relevant. Progress in art appreciation. Hey, this is me in the editing room right now. This was supposed to be a short, casual video, but I see I'm just going completely off the rails. If you made it this far into the Zachary Meisel aesthetics video, you got to subscribe. Come on. And you should find Bruce's podcast too. It's on Spotify. It's called the Theory of Anything podcast. I love the work that Bruce and Peter are doing. They're very thorough. It really fires me up. And they're really the only ones who are going this deep into Popper and David Deutsch's connection to art. So you got to support these guys.
Let me read the entire paragraph I just started reading, because it is the one that you're paraphrasing. Of course, there could be something like progress in art, in the sense that certain new possibilities may be discovered and also new problems. In music, such inventions as counterpoint revealed almost an infinity of new possibilities and problems. There is also purely technological progress, for example, in certain instruments. But although this may open new possibilities, it is not of fundamental significance. Changes in the medium may remove more problems than they create. there could conceivably be progress, even in the sense that musical knowledge grows. That is, a composer's mastery of the discoveries of all his great predecessors. But I do not think that anything like this has been achieved by any musician. Einstein may not have been a greater physicist than Newton, but he mastered Newtonian technique completely. No similar relation seems ever to have existed in the field of music. Even Mozart, who may have come closest to it, did not attain it, and Schubert did not come close to it. There is also always the danger that newly realized possibilities may kill old ones. Dynamic effects, dissonance, or even modulation may, if used too freely, dull our sensitivity to the less obvious effects of counterpoint, or say to the illusion of the old modes. Now, whatever else you might say about that paragraph, it really doesn't seem like Popper is arguing for the kind of progress in music that Deutsch is. And again, maybe I'm interpreting. I feel like Deutsch is a little more clear here than Popper is. So I'm more likely, if I'm misinterpreting one of the two gentlemen, it's probably Popper. But it does seem to me like Popper and Deutsch are at odds with each other in this way. Maybe.
Well, maybe. I mean, Deutsch definitely subscribes the idea of infinite progress, presumably infinite aesthetic progress too. Although Deutsch is kind of like a little bit of a conservative about music too. I think he likes that. He probably sees eye to eye and on if I had to guess, on Popper. With Popper, the viewpoints expressed. I mean, he doesn't like all this bad postmodern philosophy, and
Yeah,
he seems
I
to
get that
appreciate
from his tweets
Bach
also.
and
Yeah.
Beethoven and all this. So maybe it's a little bit hard to say.
Well, it's hard to predict the future. It's impossible to predict the future. It seems unlikely that there'll be another Bach. But how lucky we
Ever?
are.
I mean, maybe it's a once in a thousand
to me,
years kind of a
yeah.
thing.
To me, Bach is like a Shakespeare, level
Yeah.
composer. So, has there been another Shakespeare? Can you imagine there ever being one?
Hmm? No,
Well, there's a lot of
maybe.
people. There's a lot of people that would argue with you over that.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that's a good question that you're asking.
Yeah. No, it's a great question.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I like what Popper says about dulling our senses to certain things. Like when we're too used to dissonance, we aren't sensitive to counterpoint. It does happen sometimes. But I think it comes from two different forms, and of course, they're both knowledge related. In one sense, we may not have the knowledge of counterpoint. It's like people just don't train to hear it. So they focus on other things. It's like a problem of distraction. They've found different problems to pay attention to, and they never learn about counterpoint or learn how to distinguish counterpoint very well. It does seem like a bad thing to me, but I'm not sure why it's a major danger, because you can just always learn how to appreciate counterpoint better. You can just learn counterpoint. The other sense is where we have progress that makes old problems and old solutions obsolete. So like we no longer care about people having very powerful voices for stage plays and operas and so on, because it's been totally replaced with problems of recording and sound mixing in movies, right? So I don't think that's bad at all. And it's almost necessary for progress for older solutions to become older problems and older solutions to become obsolete. I think that's a kind of a necessary factor of progress. But generally, I think Popper's position is in line with what I've been saying. I like traditional knowledge. I think it is a huge mistake to ignore a past tradition's knowledge. I think it's almost irrational neglect. Like if past composers have created knowledge that can be used in your works of art, or they can be used to appreciate other works of art, I think that should not be neglected. Funny enough, I almost started to rant about Schoenberg creating new ways to appreciate classical music. So he articulated phrase structures of phrase structure, like sentence form, period form, other hybrid forms. He did that better than anyone before him. So his appreciation of classical musical phrases was more detailed and more generalized than anyone else. His understanding of musical phrasing was more universal. And I mean more universal than the greatest composers like Haydn, my favorite, my guy, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, all those guys. They had some understanding of musical phrasing, And Schoenberg had a better understanding of musical phrasing, and he could teach it to people. And that even progressed further. We've got folks like William Kaplan, who continued in the tradition of, I don't know what it's called, Schoenberg's musical analysis. William Kaplan improved on that even further. There's a couple other people. So there's a possibility of appreciation, music appreciation, that has increased with progress. And I don't think Popper had this in mind when he was thinking about progress in the arts and the possibility of progress in the arts. So he missed this whole dimension of progress. He was thinking about progress in art creation, but not at all in art appreciation. And then also Chris asked this really interesting question. I'm just going to let it hang. I'm not really going to say too much about it. He asks, has there been any better writers than Shakespeare? I would definitely want to clarify what the criteria of better is. Like, how do we even evaluate how good Shakespeare is? But even without a specific criteria, it is a very stimulating question. I think I would want to start with something like the fact that Shakespeare created all these new problems. He created the forms of narrative structure. He created many different archetypes of narratives and characters. All of that. There's a lot of things that started with Shakespeare, and it's fantastic. But I don't know what the specific criteria for his evaluation, how we evaluate Shakespeare. I think he created a lot of great knowledge in narrative form. And yeah, has there been anybody who's created better knowledge in narrative form? I don't know.
My favorite quote from this, which is the last couple paragraphs. But although fashions may be unavoidable, and although new styles may emerge, we ought to despise attempts to be fashionable. It should be obvious that modernism, the wish to be new or different at any price, to be ahead of one's time, to produce the work of art of the future, has nothing to do with the things an artist should value and should try to create. Historicism in art is just a mistake, yet one finds it everywhere. Even in philosophy, one hears of a new style of philosophizing or a philosophy in a new key, as if it were the key that mattered rather than the tune played, and as if it mattered whether the key was old or new. Of course, I do not blame an artist or a musician for trying to say something new. What I really blame many of the modern musicians for is their failure to love great music, the great
Yes.
masters and their miraculous works, the greatest perhaps that man has produced.
Well, there's
Just love
not a lot of wiggle room in that quote. Hey,
Hey,
come on, Popper, tell us what
I-
you really think.
I, I've had that thought so many times, listening uh, to music and thinking, do you love music? Do you actually love the great masters?
Yeah.
I responded to that so much.
Yeah. Well, it's a sad fact about the world we live in, perhaps, that so many people have never heard them. I mean, I know people who are musicians they don't go to like the symphony. They don't know what it's like to sit in front of 80 musicians on stage playing Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, Brahms or whatever. It's not something that unfortunately so many people just do not experience that.
Well, especially if you're a musician, though, you would think that you would, you know, be obsessed with the great masters of your, given musical field.
Yeah.
But not everybody is, or
Yeah.
maybe they enjoy that, but think it's not, maybe going back to the historicism thing. I have to do something different.
Yeah, it is a tragedy that people do not love great art. Something is very wrong with how we approach this as a society. Ernst Gombrich, he has described the logic of fashion, which is highly relevant to what Popper has said here. And it comes from a Popperian framework too. It's quite pessimistic about progress in art, but it's interesting no less. It's definitely something that we have to address, and I'll make a video about it. But I really hope that a knowledge-based view can address this problem of people not liking great works. And a knowledge-based view can allow people to truly appreciate art. That's what I hope. This is exactly what I'm most interested in. I want people to be able to see problems in art. I want them to be able to see solutions in art, see the beauty in art, see the knowledge in art, and also be able to identify progress and know that they can make progress both as a creator and an appreciator, because there's just so much to love about art, and there's so much more possible. We're really just at the beginning.
This is truly one of our most exciting episodes ever.
Yes, Peter. Thank you so much. It was an amazing episode. I really appreciate you driving it also. I hope to hear more on this subject.